Imagine a boardroom on the 40th floor of a Manhattan financial tower in the year 2026. Outside the window, autonomous cabs hum through streets where racial discrimination has been illegal for over 60 years. Every corporation in these buildings publishes annual diversity reports. Every school curriculum teaches that all human beings are created equal. Yet if you look 4 miles north to Harlem, you find a divide that defies modern economic logic. This chart shows the median net worth in the United States. The median white family holds 8 to 10 times the wealth of the median black family. That disparity persists even in the hospital. A college-educated black woman in 2026 faces a 3 times higher risk of dying during childbirth than a white woman who never finished high school. These numbers represent the cumulative weight of 4 centuries of property law and medical theories designed to manage a specific labor force. These modern gaps represent the consistent output of an economic engine built 400 years ago to solve a labor supply crisis. The men who designed this architecture are desked, but the legal and institutional structures they built to secure their wealth continue to manufacture these specific inequalities today. To find the source of this, we have to look at the history of the Chesapeake Bay. We often assume that racial prejudice created slavery. However, the sequence was the reverse. Economic greed created slavery, and racial hierarchy was later invented to protect the profits that slavery generated. If we view racism only as a matter of individual hearts and personal flaws, we overlook how it functions as a design for the economy. When chattel slavery ended, the legal codes and banking regulations were modified to achieve the same concentration of wealth under new names. In the early 1600s, Virginia's labor system was surprisingly fluid. Impoverished English, Irish, and African laborers worked the same tobacco fields, shared the same taverns, and often ran away together. At this time, the legal category of a unified white political class did not exist. In the summer of 1676, a rebellion led by Nathaniel Bacon united these poor, landless laborers into an interracial army that burned Jamestown to the ground. The ruling elite realized that their greatest threat was not a foreign power, but the solidarity of their own workers. If the poor united around their shared misery, the plantation owners would lose everything. Between 1680 and 1705, colonial lawmakers drove a legal wedge between their laborers. The Virginia slave codes granted poor Europeans basic legal protections and land at the end of their service. Simultaneously, they stripped Africans of all rights, declaring them permanent property. By giving poor white workers a small amount of status, a psychological wage, the elites ensured they would choose racial identity over class solidarity. To turn this into a permanent asset class, the courts overturned English common law. Usually, a child's status followed the father, but in 1662, Virginia ruled that a child's status followed the mother. This meant the children born from the sexual violence of white masters automatically increased those masters' wealth. It legally erased black fatherhood and ensured that slavery would be inherited through the blood. This legislation consolidated race into a biological caste system. It was a masterpiece of social engineering designed to protect elite assets by ensuring the working class would never stand on the same side of a line again. In the 18th century, the Enlightenment proclaimed that all men have a natural right to liberty. To keep that philosophy from threatening the profits of slavery, American intellectuals turned to pseudo-scientific race theory. If liberty was for humans, they had to redefine enslaved Africans as something less than human. They manufactured medical and biological myths to rationalize an economic crime. By 1860, the economic value of 4 million enslaved black Americans reached approximately $3.5 billion. That was more than the value of all the nation's railroads, factories, and banks combined. These bodies were the single largest financial asset in the American economy, collateralizing loans for banks in New York and London. After the Civil War, during Reconstruction, Black Americans proved how quickly they could build power when the system paused. Men like Hiram Rebels were elected to the U.S. Senate, and freed families began building schools and independent farms, but that independence was quickly undermined. When the federal government withdrew its protection, the South designed new ways to reclaim that labor. Sharecropping trapped families in debt they could never pay, while the 13th Amendment's loophole for punishment for a crime led to convict leasing. States arrested black men for minor or invented offenses and leased them to private coal mines and railroads, where many were worked to death. Where black wealth did manage to grow, it was often targeted for destruction. In 1921, the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Black Wall Street, was burned to the ground by white mobs. Generational real estate, bank deposits, and businesses were erased, draining capital that should have been passed down to descendants today. Every time the hierarchy was challenged, the machinery was adapted. The system shifted from the explicit ownership of bodies to the administrative entrapment of lives. During the Great Migration, millions of black families moved north and west to escape this terror. But as they arrived in industrial cities, they were met with violent resistance and new federal policies designed to keep them out of the rising middle class. In the 1930s, the federal government created maps to assess mortgage risk. As seen in this map of Richmond, any neighborhood with black residents was shaded red and labeled hazardous. This practice, known as redlining, meant banks refused mortgages there. Between 1934 and 1962, the government backed $120 billion in home loans, but 98% of that money went to white families. This federal subsidy built the suburbs and created the generational home equity that white families used to pay for college and start businesses. As the suburbs grew, thriving black commercial districts were physically destroyed. Federal highway projects were routed directly through these neighborhoods, slicing through the urban grid and cutting off the tax bases that supported local schools and businesses. This created a cycle that now runs without the need for individual prejudice. Because school funding is tied to local property taxes, schools in historically redlined neighborhoods receive significantly less revenue. This leads to lower college admission rates and lower salaries, which makes it harder to buy a home, ensuring the next generation starts in the same position. This was reinforced by a criminal justice system that channeled racial anxiety into the war on drugs. Coded language, like law and order, led to mandatory minimums and a 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine. Entire communities were criminalized, creating a status of civic death, where a record bars people from housing, jobs, and the right to vote. After 400 years of these policies, the system is calibrated to produce these results. The institutions simply have to run normally for the disparities to persist. We often point to black CEOs and presidents as proof that the barriers are gone, but individual high achievers do not change the aggregate reality. Exceptional success does not disprove the existence of a structural penalty. It only shows that some individuals can overcome a significantly harder obstacle course. While poverty affects people of all races, poor black families face a compounding set of obstacles. They live with the dual pressure of economic hardship and a map that has been historically drawn to limit their medical, financial, and legal safety. Navigating this requires an immense amount of mental energy. Scholars call it code switching, the constant auditing of one's tone, hair, and speech to avoid being stereotyped. This daily friction drains the creative and scientific entergy that should be fueling our entire society. This energy is spent in moments like the talk, where parents teach their children how to survive a routine traffic stop. They are taught to keep their hands visible, speak in a flat tone, and surrender their rights just to ensure they return home alive. There is a common belief that time alone will solve these issues. However, history shows that progress is not a straight line. Every major advance in equality has been met with a restructuring of the same old exclusions. The legacy of this history is a live financial ledger and a spatial map that shapes modern life every day. These systems were built by specific policy choices, which means they will only be changed by equally intentional policy choices. The design of the future is still an active choice,